If you're trying to conceive and quietly wondering if life can be whole without a baby, feeling anxious, uncertain, or weary in your faith, you're not alone. Welcome to the Infertility and Trying to Conceive podcast for Christian women. I'm Linda Renee, an Aussie wife, mum, and follower of Jesus. Here I share biblical truth, simple conception tips, offer emotional support, and have honest conversations about what struggling to conceive really looks like as a Christian woman. My prayer is that this podcast lightens your load, keeps you anchored in Christ, and helps you move forward with confidence, peace, and hope. Christ goes before you, and I'm right here helping you look to Him every step of the way. Let's begin. I want to talk today about something that can feel a little confusing and honestly, sometimes kind of overwhelming: ovulation. Now, you might find yourself rolling your eyes or thinking, yeah, I already know the basics, but hear me out because it matters. Not just for tracking your cycle or trying to time things right, but because understanding how your body works is part of caring for the body that God designed for you. It's recognizing what your body is telling you and using that knowledge to make informed choices. So I want to give you 6 things that you really need to know about ovulation. 6 things that might help make sense of what's felt confusing or inconsistent. Because I know sometimes it feels like your body is giving you mixed signals and it's exhausting trying to decode it all. So whether you're trying naturally or you're in between cycles at the fertility clinic, or whether you've been trying for a baby for a while, or you just want to understand your cycle better, this episode is for you. And my hope is that it helps you feel grounded, empowered, and even a little more hopeful in taking the next best step. So the first thing I'd recommend is to truly understand your cycle. I remember when I first started doing this, if you had asked me when I ovulated, I really had no idea. I tracked my periods to find out how long my cycles were as a teen, but I really had no idea what to do with that data. So there are basically 4 hormones that are involved in ovulation. You have follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. They both come from your pituitary gland in your brain. And you have estrogen and progesterone, which come from your ovaries. So FHS, that's the follicle stimulating hormone, that helps your follicles grow. A follicle is kind of a little bit like a water-filled sac that contains an egg. And these grow and mature, and ideally one of them breaks free and releases an egg. And that's ovulation. Meanwhile, estrogen thickens your uterine lining, making it a soft place for that egg to land. And then when your body knows it's time, you get a big spike in LH, luteinizing hormone. And that's your body's signal to release the egg. After ovulation, progesterone steps in, and that's kind of like the homemaker hormone, making your uterine lining ready and possible for implantation. And your luteal phase, that's the time after ovulation. And that needs to be at least 11 days long. That window gives your body time for fertilization and implantation to happen. So if your body calls it quits too early after you ovulate, your progesterone levels drop and your period arrives, and this sheds the uterine lining, and that takes any fertilized egg that may have implanted with it. So if your luteal phase is shorter than 11 days, that might be an indication that you need some help to increase its length so you have the best chance of an early pregnancy sticking. But this is also something that I didn't realize for a long time. When you get your period, it can bring this really huge disappointment. But your period actually isn't a sign that your body's failing. It's actually evidence that you did ovulate, that your body went through the process. But it wasn't God's plan for things to line up that particular month. So if you're feeling like you're feeling betrayed by your body, like it's not doing what it's supposed to, please hear this. God designed your body to give you feedback. Even if that feedback isn't what you were hoping for, it means that you can get help to rectify what's going on in your body that could be impacting your fertility. So in general, a monthly cycle is usually somewhere between 24 and 35 days. It's basically the length of your cycle from the beginning of your period until the beginning of your next period. And it's generally around a month, which is why we often call it a monthly cycle. But it's certainly not set at 28 days for every single person. You might have longer cycles and others might have shorter ones. So if your cycle isn't spot on 28 days, you're not behind, you're not off. I've seen this big misconception out there that ovulation always occurs on day 14. But ovulating on day 14 is based on a 28-day cycle. So if your cycle is not 28 days long, you will not likely ovulate on day 14. But honestly, only about 10 to 20% of women actually fit that mold anyway. So if you're not textbook example, you're actually normal. And here's a second important thing to know. If you've had a period, then you most likely did ovulate at some point that month, usually around 14 days before. And this is especially helpful if you have conditions like polycystic ovarian syndrome or PCOS, and you're wondering if you're ovulating at all. Because conditions like PCOS can make it tricky to know what's happening for you. And part of the reason is that your body actually makes several attempts to ovulate before it actually succeeds. And that is why you might have long cycles or see fertile signals or signs come and go in your cycle. But the thing to note here is that if you get a period, and I mean like a proper period, not just some spotting or a light bleed that doesn't usually feel like a period, but if you get a proper period, it means that your body's last attempt at ovulation was successful. And your period usually arrives somewhere between 11 and 17 days after you have ovulated. The next important thing, in fact, this is actually kind of three important things in one here, and that's knowing the ways that you can track ovulation and how to use those ways to track, and then how to understand what it all means. So there's lots of ways to approach tracking your cycle and to learn when you're ovulating. And here's the thing, there isn't just one right way to do that. Different methods can work for different women, and depending on where you are emotionally and physically, some will feel more sustainable than others. So I want to walk you through a few common options and share what's actually helpful and what can sometimes become overwhelming so that you can make a wise, grounded choice. So you can basically just use simple pen and paper tracking charts if you wish. There's phone apps out there as well, and also you can get more in-depth monitors that you can wear or use to track your ovulation signals. And these monitors can be helpful, especially if you find that the actual monitoring of everything a bit complex or overwhelming, or simply if your daily routines are just all over the place. But this also might be where you start to spiral. You open your fertility app and you see a bunch of graphs, and suddenly you're like, wait, was this my fertile window? Did I miss it? Why does this one look different from last month? And I get it. It can feel like there's this secret code that you're somehow supposed to just know how to read. So when you look at your body signals, rather than seeing them as your body failing you, it might be helpful to think of them as feedback from an experiment. It shows you what's happening, what's aligning, what might need more attention. These signals don't define your worth as a woman, and they don't measure your capacity to conceive. They're simply information, tools to help you understand your cycle and care for your body. And once you start paying attention, like really paying attention, you start to see patterns. I use a pretty simple app these days called Read Your Body, and it's a non-for-profit app, and it doesn't predict ovulation like other apps who basically use thousands of other women's cycles to tell you when you'll ovulate, and that's but really just based on what they consider as typical. But if you've been on this fertility journey for any length of time, um, you know already that often there's nothing typical about this. Those typical cycles are not your cycle. And so I'm in the camp of learning the tools to know your own cycle rather than having an app to predict it. Because, hey, it might just get it wrong and then you might end up even more confused. So instead of guessing, you can learn to observe. Record what you actually see. Let your body tell you what's happening instead of an algorithm trying to fill in the blanks. And there's other methods too. Some other methods out there, they check your saliva. I think I used one back in the day. It was called Maybe Baby. And these basically work because the amount of salt in your body increases when you're about to ovulate. So when the saliva dries on the little microscope, the salt crystals form patterns that look like ferns and that indicates that you're about to ovulate. But again, yeah, they're not always accurate, and they can end up leaving you feeling more confused. And of course, there's ovulation predictor tests. That's basically where, you pee on a stick, and these typically track the surge in luteinizing hormone in your body and tell you when you're about to have that surge and when you're likely to ovulate after that. You can get cheap ones online, you can get them in bulk packs, or you can get digital ones that give you a readout, and sometimes they actually give you a readout of other fertility hormones as well. But again, and just a side note, if you have PCOS and your body has this, these multiple attempts of ovulating, it also has multiple attempts of that luteinizing hormone surging. And so oftentimes you'll have multiple positive tests, and that can be confusing when you're using these luteinizing hormone test strips. Now, one of the most common methods out there is tracking your basal body temperature, your resting temperature, the first thing in the morning. It's simple, but it takes consistency. Your basal body temperature is basically your resting body temperature. You wake up, and before you even move or sit up, you grab your thermometer, you pop it under your tongue, and you wait for it to beep. When I used to do it, it became this little ritual, one tiny act of hope before the day began. I'd record that reading in my app, and over time, patterns did start to emerge. And here's how it works. When ovulation happens, your progesterone rises, and that raises your body temperature too. So, how do you confirm that ovulation has happened? Well, it's when you see a consistent increase, usually 3 high attempts in a row after at least 6 lower ones. And when you see this pattern, you have a good idea that ovulation likely occurred around the day that the temperature went up and stayed up for those 3 consecutive days. And after you ovulate, your temperature generally stays elevated until your next period arrives. It will bump around a little bit, but generally at a higher level than before you ovulate. Now, there's 2 things about tracking cycles that I think a lot of people get confused about, and these are, first, tracking your basal body temperature is retrospective. This means it tells you when you've already ovulated, not when you're about to ovulate. So if you're waiting for that temperature spike before you time intimacy, you've probably missed your window. So the key word here is after. Temperature tracking shows that you have ovulated after the fact. Basal body temperature tracking is confirmation, not prediction. And the second thing is the calendar method, or the rhythm method, isn't very reliable because it presumes that everyone ovulates on day 14. Each person's cycle is unique, as we've talked about earlier. And day 14 is simply just an average, not a rule for everyone. In fact, only 10 to 20% of women actually ovulate on day 14, which means that 80 to 90% ovulate outside that range. And so if you personally don't ovulate on day 14, you might be setting yourself up for disappointment if you're trying to conceive using the rhythm method or the calendar method and your cycle falls outside the average range. I think there are more accurate ways to track ovulation, and one of these ways is checking your cervical fluid. Now, just a side note, you might hear this called cervical mucus or vaginal mucus, and although it is technically mucus and it is part of our immune system, I think we often connect the word mucus with something, green and gross that might come out of our nose when we have a bad cold. So I prefer to use the word cervical or cervical fluid to make this whole topic less taboo and easier to talk about. And in my opinion, the most accurate real-time way to know if you're ovulating without having to use blood tests, ultrasounds, or invasive methods is tracking your cervical fluid, although it does take practice to recognize what your regular ovulation pattern looks like. If you've never done this before, it might seem a little bit ick at first to check your cervical fluid, but God designed our bodies to provide signals to show when we are ovulating naturally. And unlike other methods like basal body temperature, which tells you that you've ovulated after it has occurred, your cervical fluid changes happen before and during ovulation, which help give you advance notice. Using both basal body temperature and cervical fluid together, I think can provide a really good picture of what your body's doing. And so, a very quick overview of understanding your cycle in relation to cervical fluid is basically that your cycle can be broken up into 4 phases. So, at the beginning of your cycle, when you have your period, you're not usually fertile. But in saying that, women have ovulated and gotten pregnant when they're on their period. So, you can't completely exclude that phase. And this is simply because the bleeding can mask any fertile fluid that you actually might have there. So after your period ends, you then enter your follicular phase, and that's basically where your follicles are growing, and usually just one becomes the dominant follicle. Your fluid here is usually dry or tacky, and this means it's not fertile. The sperm can't survive in dry or tacky fluid. And here's something helpful to understand. Sperm can last for an average of 5 to 6 days inside a woman's body, but that really only occurs when fertile cervical fluid is present. When it's not fertile, i.e., it's dry or tacky, die very quickly, within hours. So it's better to have sex before ovulation when fertile fluid is present rather than waiting until after you ovulate. Once your egg is released, it only lasts for about 24 hours before it's absorbed back into your body. And towards the end of this follicular phase, you'll notice your cervical fluid change from dry or sticky to slippery or wet. And that last day of the slippery, wet, or stretchy fluid, that is the day, or what we would call your ovulation phase, which is very short, and it's basically the day that you ovulate. Now, if you've got polycystic ovarian syndrome or PCOS, as I mentioned earlier, your body can attempt to ovulate like a number of times. So you might see this wet, slippery, or stretchy fluid come and go until your body finally gets over the line with ovulation. And this can increase the length of your cycles because your body has multiple attempts at trying to ovulate. And that can be confusing when you're trying to naturally identify when you're ovulating. But once you notice that stretchy, wet, or slippery fertile fluid has gone back to tacky or dry, and your period arrives around about 13 to 17 days later, it means you ovulated 2 weeks prior. And then you've moved into your luteal phase, which is the phase where an egg that hasn't been fertilized is either absorbed back into your body or one that has been fertilized implants into the lining of your uterus. And if you're pregnant, a mucus plug forms in your cervix at this point, and it stays there until your baby's about to be born. Or if the current egg wasn't fertilized, this plug keeps further sperm from entering your cervix and basically closes the door to pregnancy until your cycle resets and your period arrives. So understanding and tracking your cycle can help give you insight into what's happening with your body and can provide good indications if something is not quite right. Remember though, the goal isn't perfection, it's understanding. When you know what's happening in your cycle, you can make choices based on real information, not just guesswork. And there are so many factors at work that impact your fertility. If you go and see your general practitioner, they may get you to confirm ovulation through what's called a day 21 progesterone test. The idea of this test is to measure how much progesterone your body produces after ovulation, or if it's producing progesterone at all. A lot of general practitioners will just order the test for day 21 of your cycle based on the assumption that I mentioned earlier, and that's that everyone ovulates on day 14. So you would get the test done 7 days later if you ovulated on day 14, and that would make it day 21. But this is something really worth understanding because if you ovulate after day 14, the test won't provide an accurate picture. Your progesterone levels will be lower than they actually are 7 days after you ovulate. And if your cycle is much longer and you ovulate even after day 21, then the test results, they'll just say that you haven't ovulated at all, which of course you haven't yet. So if you haven't ovulated when you get the blood test done, there will be almost no progesterone in your system, and your doctor then might assume that you actually just haven't ovulated at all, or that you don't ovulate at all. So the issue isn't with the test itself. The issue is with when the test is done. So it really shouldn't be called a 21-day test, because that assumes that everyone ovulates on day 14. So that's something to keep in mind if your doctor orders this test for you. And one more thing that I think is important to know about ovulation is that there are so many things that need to fall into place to enable a pregnancy. I'm amazed there aren't more couples who struggle to conceive, because there are so many factors that can impact our fertility. Think about everything that needs to happen. The sperm needs to develop correctly. They need to swim in the right direction and at the right speed. You need to develop enough follicles and have one mature properly, have it released and travel without hindrance down the fallopian tube. Your cervical fluid needs to get rid of dodgy sperm and to draw quality sperm into the uterus. And the egg and sperm need to join, fuse, grow, implant, and stay there. And so that's why I'm such a strong believer in getting to the root cause of any fertility issues rather than just treating symptoms. Medications like Clomid can definitely help, but it's not always the answer, as it can simply be a band-aid if you've got underlying problems. So there's so many things that need to happen correctly, and there's so many places where things can just not line up. And things like gut health can be a factor. Eating certain foods can have an inflammatory effect on our gut, which is why some fertility diets recommend cutting out things like gluten and dairy. And around about 70 to 80% of our immune system is believed to be in our gut, and they sometimes even call it a second brain. But when your gut gets inflamed, it can throw off the delicate balance of your body, including hormones, because everything in your system is so interconnected. And stress is another factor. Now, I think that infertility generally causes stress more than stress causes infertility. But once you're experiencing fertility challenges, managing your stress can definitely improve your outcomes, as stress does affect your hormones as well. So as I wrap this up, I'll quickly recap the 6 things about ovulation to keep in mind. Understand your cycle. A true period means you have actually ovulated. Know the ways that you can track ovulation. Know how to use those methods and understand what the signs and symptoms of ovulation mean, and also that many factors are at play in your fertility. I also just want to say, learning about your cycle, your ovulation, your body, it's not about making you feel like you're failing or broken. It's about helping you see what's happening in a season that can feel heavy and confusing. If you've been trying without success for a while, I hope this information might give you some insight into what may be happening. Sometimes just tracking your cycle properly can make all the difference. But if you've been trying for more than a year, or 6 months if you're over 35, it might be time to seek some professional help. But also, don't forget that God sees you in all of this. He sees the waiting, the frustration, the hope, and the heartbreak. And He cares about how this season shapes you, even when it feels hard. So I hope this information helps you better understand how God designed your body. Knowledge can help you understand your cycle and be empowering when you're trying to conceive. Before you go, thank you so much for listening. I pray today's episode has brought you fresh hope for whatever comes next. If someone comes to mind today who could truly use support in this space, please share this episode or the podcast with them. It might be exactly what they need. And if you could take 30 seconds to give me a star rating or leave 1 or 2 sentences about what this podcast has meant to you on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, I'd be ever so grateful. Your feedback not only helps others find the podcast, but it truly makes my day. And words of affirmation are my love language. And if you're not sure how to do that, I'll pop the links in the show notes below. Lastly, although I do have a nursing degree, everything shared in this podcast is for inspiration and education only. Please don't use it as a replacement for advice from your personal, medical, or mental health professional. There's absolutely no shame in getting additional support when you need it, but always consult your expert team before making any changes to your fertility journey. That's all from me today. Take care, and I'll catch you next time. Bye.